Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Dispatches from the Energy Transition. Today, we're going to go bigger, hyperscalers, in fact, as part of our discussion. Episode 13 will focus on data centers, energy innovation, and the modern grid. One of the items that we'll obviously talk about are the challenges and opportunity around increased demand, the rapid growth of artificial intelligence, and the need for big, massive computational power. We've got an exciting episode today. As usual, I'm joined with my co-host, Lucas Miller, Senior Engineering Consultant of Mayfield Renewables. And I'm the principal of Outfit, a design studio that focuses on the energy transition. How are you doing today, Lucas?
Doing well. We're kind of in full swing here in Portland. It's 80 degrees yesterday. It should be 80 again tomorrow. So no complaints. How about you? How are things in Bend, Robert?
It's good weather. A little bit focused on the Knicks and basketball tonight. We'll see how that goes. But excited to delve into this topic today. You and I, in our day jobs or our roles, we focus more on the mid-market segment, but it's going to be pretty interesting to delve into scale. What have you found interesting as we've been doing some market research and having conversations about this topic?
Yeah, I think what's really great about this topic is how local it is. And that's just speaking personally as someone that lives in Portland, Oregon. And as we'll touch on today, we have an expert guest from the region. So I really like that a lot of this is happening in our backyard. It's pretty close to home. Hopefully more of the technologies involved can also be built and manufactured close to home as well. But all of that we'll dig into today. I do want to remind folks a couple housekeeping notes as well. We have the Q&A tab in Zoom here. We encourage you to please submit any questions in that tab and not the chat tab. It's a little easier for us to keep track of. We will be sharing links throughout in the chat tab to a few resources we'll walk through today, as well as a couple events happening over the next few weeks. So encourage you to keep an eye out on the chat tab, but please submit any questions in the Q&A. And one final reminder that we will share this recording with everyone later this week. So you will get access to the full webinar as well as speaker contact information if you want to follow up with anyone. With that, I want to bring our guest speakers in, starting with Adib Nasle, co-founder and CEO of Xendee. How's it going, Adib? Do you want to introduce yourself to our audience today?
Doing well. Pleasure to be with you today. And I'm co-founder and CEO of Xendee, a software company out of San Diego, California, that's focused on the microgrid and complex distributed energy systems for mission critical and commercial industrial sectors. Nice to be with you.
Likewise. Thanks, Adib. We're also joined by Skip Newberry, a fellow Portlander, president and CEO of the Technology Association of Oregon, which henceforth I will refer to as TAO or TAO for those in the audience. Skip, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you, Lucas?
No complaints. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And in terms of our background at the association, we're a regional tech trade association with roughly 500 member companies. And we do a lot of work across multiple different subsectors within technology. That includes software, IT, material science, clean technology, semiconductors, electronics, and also, of course, things like AI and fintech and cybersecurity. So it's as tech is more ubiquitous, so are we as an association. And we do a lot of work here in Oregon and Southwest Washington covering tech and policy, professional development, and market development opportunities on behalf of the state, where we're trying to either solve for collective action problems or chase a bunch of opportunities that present themselves to the state that have an economic win for the companies that are here trying to build and grow.
If it's kind of funny because I moved to Portland almost 20 years ago to get into energy. And you were one of the very first people that I met in my role with the Energy Trust of Oregon. But I'm kind of curious, given your background and perspective, how much is energy demand impacting your membership, right? I mean, like this, we've been talking about this for over a year, but give us a little bit of your perspective in regard to town membership and the segments that you're seeing most impacted.
Yeah. I mean, really all of them are impacted by constraints up and down our grid infrastructure, transmission lines. And a lot of this is driven by what I talked about earlier, which is tech is more ubiquitous. It means that more people are using it. That's increasing strains on our energy system. Compute power is also increasing, right? You have new emerging technologies, generative AI just being one of them, but also blockchain technologies and certain types of cryptocurrencies. All of them put demands on our infrastructure, and that extends down into data centers and also other types of producers of technology. And so here in Oregon, we also have a lot of very intense R&D operations focused on next generation semiconductors, electronics devices. And those facilities obviously require a fair amount of energy to power them. And so we have demands up and down the technology stack, and each of those challenges or areas of increased demand also represent opportunities for innovation for clean technology companies and also for tech companies that are offering solutions where they've figured out ways to kind of achieve the same business outcome or result without necessarily drawing on as much compute power. So both a blessing and a curse, a challenge and an opportunity, depending on which lens you're looking through it.
Yeah, and I want to
appreciate that. Yeah.
I want to maybe build off that a little bit. And what is it about Oregon in particular? Is it something geographical, something about the workforce here? What makes you bullish about Oregon as a hub, specifically in climate tech? So thinking, renewables, distributed energy resources. What is it about Oregon that makes you bullish about this region?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the state has had a long history in thinking about how to kind of preserve the environment. And that plays out in terms of some of the urban planning and civic policies and decisions made over many decades. Everything from transportation planning to an urban growth boundary around many of the cities in the state, constraining growth or limiting it in certain ways to preserve natural environments and farmland. And I think what we're seeing too is that there is now kind of a new wave of innovation that's concentrating in a couple of areas that are also supported by the data. And those areas include things like energy storage systems, like batteries, areas like solar. And both of those areas require and rely on a lot of the same skills and talent that exist within the semiconductor industry here, and also rely on similar types of manufacturing infrastructure. And so we're known as a global hub for semiconductors. In fact, Oregon accounts for 15% of the United States semiconductor workforce, which most people don't realize. And a huge percentage of that 15% is focused on R&D. And so as we think about next generation technologies and having the right talent and infrastructure to not only design and prototype, but also start to bring those solutions to scale, we have a lot of that here. The other interesting aspect to this when thinking about clean technology is, yes, the policy environment, which I alluded to earlier, some of the infrastructure and workforce, which we just talked about, but then also thinking about some of the other stakeholders. So we have relatively forward-thinking utilities that are focused on decarbonization and have been arguably a little bit earlier than some of the other utilities elsewhere in the US. You can point to other examples globally of folks who are even farther ahead. But that being said, at least in the US context, we have some interesting players doing some great work. And then there's also a willingness, I think, on many of them to start to look at, can they serve as sort of a bit of a laboratory for testing newer technologies as grid modernization and decarbonization efforts kind of get going. And then the other part of it is thinking about some of the infrastructure that's federally funded and supported, like Bonneville Power Authority. So we have a lot of dams along the Columbia River that produce a lot of hydropower and electricity, and it's cleaner than other forms. It's got some of its, everything has issues, and that does as well. But again, there's trade-offs in a lot of this, but at least compared to, say, coal, it's an interesting alternative. And so a lot of the data centers that have decided to locate here from a retail standpoint, and also a lot of the major tech companies and other entities that have data centers as part of vertically integrated organizations, have also chosen this area because of access to relatively clean, abundant power. And so those are all things that are interesting pieces of a larger set of infrastructure that you would look to if you were trying to decide what regions have the right mix of capabilities to address some of these challenges that we face societally, and also realize the full potential when it comes to some of the innovation opportunities.
That's great. Thank you, Skip. I know that Tao is very focused on innovation, and I think that's a great segue into our other guest here, Adib. It's always good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Excited to talk about Xendee, particularly as it relates to this subject. I know that I first got aware of Xendee when I lived in San Diego several years back, and particularly was interested in the microgrid aspect of your software and the modeling of which Mayfield works with. But Xendee is a really powerful tool, particularly related to data centers. Talk to us a little bit about, Xendee's vision, right? And how you try to future-proof for technologies.
Our vision from the beginning, really why we started the company, has been that energy and energy infrastructure is going to become more complicated and not simpler. So you mentioned the 25 plus technologies that our software platform supports. It's all around being able to offer outcomes that are, economic from a financial perspective. They're resilient from a operations perspective, and then sustainable as well. And the first area we decided to tackle was really addressing the feasibility, the planning, and the design. Because when you get into hyperscale data centers, these are massive, massive energy consumers, and small inefficiencies that you would normally not worry about with a traditional, let's say, data center or a traditional CNI project, really get magnified because it's just the size, the scale. So little things become big things, and they matter. And we set out to build a software platform that arms industry with what they've been missing, and really bridging a lot of gaps to make sure that these distributed energy systems, these cogeneration, trigeneration solutions out there are able to be deployed at scale and with a high level of confidence, and really improve customer adoption when it comes to new technology. So one of the things when we said, hey, let's start a company to address the complexity that we envision, was to also to make sure that we can implement and integrate novel new technologies. I mean, past maybe 50, 60 years, electrical systems weren't all that different. Whether it was backup systems, grid connected with backup systems, but then all of a sudden you got battery energy storage coming on, you got smart inverters, grid forming inverters, linear generators, fuel cells, and even small modular nuclear reactors. So it's been a very exciting time. And at the same
Not
time,
boring.
being able to offer those options, those technology options to industry so that they can design and deploy and operate these systems is an important part of our vision and mission.
I kind of want to thank you for that. I want to follow up on that question a bit. I've been following your co-founder, Michael Stadler, and a lot of the work on the white paper and focus on data centers and so forth. But can you talk a little bit about why you think microgrids, they don't have to be a future solution, right? The technology is accessible. Can you provide your perspective why we can make a greater impact today?
Absolutely. I mean, the fundamental nut to crack, I would say, was to have the ability to plan and design a data center and its microgrid with a high level of confidence. And when I say design the data center, I don't mean from an architectural perspective, but from an energy profile view. And the growth, and it's not just data centers. There's also all this onshoring that's occurring of critical supply chains, from chip manufacturing to pharmaceuticals, and they are all very energy sensitive. So, and they can't really deal with downtimes, and energy is a major piece of their OpEx. And microgrids are now, we wanted to eliminate fear and improve customer adoption through confidence. And that's what makes microgrids accessible today. That wasn't possible 5-6 years ago, is that complexity has now been obfuscated with a peer-reviewed technology that, our design platform won the Edison Gold Award, and our real-time operation layer for energy management systems won the Edison Bronze Award just a couple of months ago. So if we can really accelerate this transformation to these on-site energy systems, and the technologies now, you talked about what makes them accessible now. They're not science projects anymore. I mean, we were talking about batteries, right? Imagine what a battery project might have looked like 10 years ago or 12 years ago versus what it is today. It's a fairly well understood, tested, and battle-proven piece of technology. And the same with other distributed energy technologies as well. And then there's some that we don't really know, but we want to consider as options, like the nuclear option. So having an unbiased, generative algorithm that provides a set of options and outcomes with a high level of confidence, and then to be able to build that system and operate it as efficiently as possible to deliver on those benefits that were projected in the plan, is what we felt was missing and what we actually solved and are delivering. So those all together arm and bring confidence to a multitude of stakeholders, and the technology risk has really been addressed over the past few years, where the performance, the reliability, and the maintenance and operational expenses around a lot of these distributed energy technologies has been looked at very carefully by the folks that actually put money at risk behind these projects.
Yeah, and I like that you mentioned
Adib.
confidence. I think is a big component of this, especially with microgrids, and it's something that we see a lot on the Mayfield side. We are Xendee users. We rely on Xendee for financial and energy modeling as part of our microgrid feasibility studies. For us, that's much more commercial scale, the medium-sized systems, typically just solar, battery, maybe a generator. But like you mentioned, Adib, there's a lot of alternate, more bleeding edge, cutting edge technologies in the platform that you can integrate. I'm wondering what of those do you see users most interested in? So what beyond your typical energy storage gen set solar setup are you seeing today and in the near future?
Sure. And let me just give you a little context around the rationale for having some technologies that maybe are bleeding edge and very novel, is that when you put in a distributed energy system, and as you at Mayfield do this day in and day out, you want to have as much flexibility, and the microgrid inherently can deliver that flexibility, not only from the ability to really adopt renewable generation and technologies, but also the ability to consider and plan for future technologies. So just as we said I was talking earlier about how we envision the energy consumer becoming a prosumer that really is going to drive a lot of complexity into the opportunities. But with complexity, usually that drives fear, not confidence. Whenever something gets really, really complex, then people start having a lot of doubts. And we really felt it was important to take that roadblock out of the way and be able to bring a science-based, streamlined approach to it. And the technologies we're seeing that people are really excited about. I mean, SMRs are on the news, have been in the news, and there's a lot of push and momentum within the ecosystem around those. But also, there's a lot of innovation occurring on the inverter side, a lot of innovation occurring on the generator side, like I mentioned, linear generators, and different ways to leverage these capabilities to have that economic justification and then all the benefits that you can stack on top of it. But we see customers really, having the standard configuration with standard technologies, gen sets, batteries, solar, but also then moving into combined heat and power and absorption chillers, electric chillers. And then from a storage perspective, we're talking battery energy storage, but we also see customers looking for chilled water storage, hot water, and the need to address multiple loads. And as you bring those in, we felt that a piece of software and technologies was needed to help on the technical and financial decision support for them. But we see a lot of interest around linear generators, around SMRs, and then around CHP.
So as we kind of segue into the heart of our program here and get into the data center aspect of it, there's a few significant issues. One, obviously, we're increasing energy demands. On the flip side, there could be a large-scale grid resource. And there's a motivation, which is the larger theme of dispatches to begin with and what we talk about every month. How do we innovate to solve problems? Before we delve into this further, we have a question from the audience. Mark Lapata does a lot of microgrid work out on the islands. Great question. Why is a data center microgrid model more difficult than, say, a large resort? Do you want to delve into that, Adib?
Yeah. So large resorts, where you might have common buildings, common grounds, and then also maybe luxury suites and buildings, along with retail for restaurants and everything that goes into a resort: bar, restaurant, swimming pool, pool pumps. You can have downtime, I would say, if the pool pump doesn't work, or if the ice maker in the restaurant maybe doesn't get electricity at the right time for the rush to start making ice. But when we look at data centers, and specifically the hyperscale data centers, just to give perspective to maybe answer that question more succinctly, is a hyperscale data center can be 80,000, comparable to 80,000 to 100,000 homes. I haven't seen a resort that big. Maybe it exists, but that's a city. And it's a city that has to run very, very efficiently, has to deliver a high level of resilience and reliability. And at the same time, it's all got to be economically justified. So when we're talking hyperscale data centers, we're talking city-sized power plants that need to come in, and you really need to run them efficiently. And just to give kind of the range, 400 megawatts to gigawatts. The resorts may be pushing towards the lower end of some of that, but I would suspect it would be at the very, very, very lower end of that, or maybe a fraction of that. And that's a difference. As I mentioned at the beginning, small inefficiencies become highly magnified. And I think with the resorts, hotels, casinos, whatever it might be, sure, they're big electric loads, but their size, I think, is significantly less. And when I say size, I mean just the load that has to be delivered typically is a lot less than 1 gigawatt. And you can get away with some inefficiencies. Same with standard data centers. You can get away with some inefficiencies. But big systems, small things matter. And I think that's a big difference between microgrids that you plan and how you operate them for AI and data analytics and all these really, really large computational challenges, to perhaps the end use cases that need to be supported within a resort that maybe some are critical, but that critical load is a fraction of the larger load. While data centers, it's all critical load, pretty much.
Scale plays a very big factor, and I think that's a good point to segue here. Skip, you and I have been talking quite a bit. Feels like past year or two, feel like our worlds are converging a bit. Energy availability, diversification, and grid modernization are a big issue for your hyperscalers, right? Who
Yes.
are a part of Tau, right? Which is, I think, why we're talking often. What speaking with the Googles, the Metas, the Amazons of the world, what message are they wanting to convey about the importance of data centers from your lens?
Yeah, I mean, data centers are kind of vital, right? Not even kind of, they're vital to everything that we rely on in terms of our modern existence. Everything from our cell phones that we carry around with us everywhere in our pockets, to the computers that we rely on that are increasingly embedded in more and more things, whether it's your home, your office, your vehicle, etc. And as we think about the role of some of these hyperscaler data centers in powering all of this, it's a huge opportunity for us on the one hand, in terms of the amount of data that is now possible to be analyzed, interpreted, leveraged in new and interesting ways for insights. And we've seen a number of interesting breakthroughs in areas like healthcare and planning from an urban environment standpoint when it comes to digital twins, looking at different site safety issues and construction facilities, to how do you effectively automate more manufacturing processes that are unsafe for humans. So there's a lot of positive benefits to what AI and this increase in compute power enables. However, with it comes costs, right? I mean, there's has been said on multiple occasions during the course of this conversation, we're seeing a huge increase in the amount of energy. And so when you look at things, as was mentioned earlier, like Microsoft effectively, optioning 3 Mile Island from a nuclear energy standpoint, to Adib's comment earlier, it kind of helps bring things more into scale in terms of the size that we're talking about here and the amount of demand, right, for energy. When you're talking about a massive nuclear facility essentially powering some of this. And so when you're looking at different sort of approaches that have since emerged, there's also a shift towards, in some cases, modular data centers and also modular nuclear. And some of what we saw with DeepSeek just in the last few months was an approach farther upstream around what are the types of call and response requests made of large language models. And there's also a shift on the part of businesses in managing more effectively some of the data related needs by focusing on what are known as little language models that maybe don't require as much compute power. So again, there's all these opportunities for greater efficiency. Now, the challenge is, if you talk to some of the hyperscalers, they would say, hey, we want to make sure everything's on the table because we've got this massive increase in demand that we're seeing. And we need to think about, in a stepped way, how do we make sure that we can continue to deliver and meet that demand without necessarily breaking the existing system and without necessarily introducing a ton of risk. And right now, one of the perceptions is that if you shift too quickly to full-on renewables, that the renewables won't be enough to effectively meet the demand consistently, especially when stuff spikes. And so, again, it's a really complex set of challenges, and there's trade-offs all over the place.
It's hugely
So,
complex. Yeah. I mean, I think I don't want to interrupt you, Skip, but I think this kind of segues into another comment from the audience. And I think that you want to get this perspective out there, in part, I think, for some of the hyperscalers or your membership. But do the hyperscalers recognize themselves the importance of microgrids and renewables? Because you can look at it, the baseload aspect, the flexibility aspect. Can you speak to that through their lens a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the conversations that we've been having with some of the hyperscalers and even the retail data centers, is they want to make sure that there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of different options on the table when they're looking at ultimately what does the business need? Well, they need to make sure that they're meeting demand, right? Otherwise, problems happen for their business. And so if they can ensure a certain amount of consistency by any means sort of possible, and ideally looking at how do they make it so that it's environmentally aware and low CO2 impact, right, in terms of the available options. And I think too that there's an interest in looking at different business models and constraints, where a lot of the hyperscalers have been trying to figure out how do we engage with the state and other stakeholders like utilities really at the outset and get ahead of the issue. You have lots of situations and scenarios around the country where a single utility has been supplying a particular data center, and demand spikes at the data center, and that utility doesn't have enough capacity to meet the spike in demand. And so they end up having to purchase, quote unquote, dirty energy on the open market to kind of meet the demand. But if you've got sort of an approach where you're building out more infrastructure with an eye toward greater flexibility and potential spikes, you can scale up and down as needed. And ideally, you'd want to have, more sort of distributed energy and other solutions, microgrids, et cetera, as part of that mix. So I think there's an opportunity there for many of the communities that are working with the hyperscalers to have more of a yes and approach, as opposed to thinking in kind of old antiquated mindsets where it's fixed. Okay, we've got this one piece of infrastructure. I think a lot of the hyperscalers are willing to look at, okay, what kind of investments are needed to kind of broaden the mix of available options.
And
Thank you,
Skip, I
Skip.
want to follow up on that. You mentioned hyperscalers, some big tech firms, Apple, Amazon, Meta, et cetera, really looking to build a lot of these. And I think we've touched on scale from an individual facility perspective. Like Adib mentioned, we could be in the gigawatt range per data center. But how would you describe the pace of development more broadly? So combining the tech sector into one bundle and the sector itself, what does the pace of this development look like? And is that going to change in the next few years?
I think it's incredible, and the pace. There was a conversation that happened here in Portland end of last year with Brad Smith from Microsoft, and he was just talking about the tens of billions of dollars that they had spent over the last essentially 30 days globally, just acquiring data center infrastructure. And that was to, again, meet the demand that they saw coming down the pike. And I think that there is, of course, always the caveat that, there could be some sort of a retrenchment in terms of that demand. Yes, there could be a little bit of a softening of an AI bubble at some point. But, the AI train has left the building, and it is moving forward in a big way. And I think the only question is how much adoption and when, and there could be some swings, minor back and forth, but the momentum and everything is moving in a particular direction that I don't see stopping anytime soon. And so we've got a limited window right now where we can kind of start to plan for certain things and take into account certain assumptions, but who knows how long that window is going to be. I mean, some folks have been pointing at 2027 or 2030 as kind of a massive spike in AI adoption. But even the experts are a bit all over the place when it comes to getting to precise years in terms of predictions.
Yeah. And it's that lack of preciseness that drives the need for, I would say, a multi-step approach to how you really tackle the energy needs of these projects. So as Skip was talking around the growth for data centers, but also just flexibility. And with that flexibility, I think it opens up a lot of opportunities for value streams that normally would not be exposed within the traditional approach to meeting the energy needs.
Great. And I know we do have a couple of slides on kind of what that multi-stage kind of phased approach to development could look like. First, I do want to quickly touch on what we mean when we say a hyperscaler and how we define that versus a traditional data center. Adib, in our prep calls leading up to this, I think you gave a great kind of shorthand description of how you think of traditional versus hyperscaler and its impact on energy needs from a facility perspective. So if you could kind of elaborate on how you see it and how that may change the infrastructure or those peak demand spikes.
Sure. I'll just first give an overview of what a traditional data center means and what a hyperscale data center mean and what they're trying to do. What is the mission of the facility? So when we're talking traditional data centers, these are facilities that are hosting websites, web applications, multimedia solutions, but the intensity of the compute workload is very different. And also just the amount of energy that needs to be provided to run those sorts of workloads is just at a completely different scale than a hyperscaler. So you might have like a standard data center that's hosting a websites or web apps or your traditional activities. You're looking at a rack that can range maybe around 5 to 15 kilowatts with somewhat simple air cooling systems that are pretty good and sufficient for these lower density setups. So overall, just that creates a less overhead on the energy demand for that facility's mission. But hyperscalers, it's just a whole different ballpark. And I didn't bring this up to the earlier conversation, the difference between like a large resort and data center. Another is the thermal. I mean, all that electricity that goes in turns into a heat. And then you gotta really have some sophisticated and advanced cooling systems. And then when it comes to that server rack energy consumption and electric load, it can exceed 50 kilowatts. So you're going from 5 to 50, and it's just going to grow. That's the thing. It's not like being constrained or becoming less of an energy load. It's just going to continuously grow over time. So you have high density server racks that are 10, 20 times, more electricity consumption than your typical rack in a standard data center. Then you can't just get away with your traditional air cooling systems. You need more advanced, like liquid cooling, and then you to just manage the heat from these. And then the workload is such that it consumes a lot of energy. These GPUs and TPUs, they just operate and consume electricity at a far different intensity level than a standard data center. So much less intensive tasks, like I mentioned, web hosting and data management, and a lot of reliance, I would say, on CPUs that have lower power demands. And then when we look at training large language models or inferences and high performance computing, that was a term a while ago, and I think it applies to hyperscalers as well. There's just a whole different level of requirement for the electricity. It's 10 to 100 times more energy per server than traditional workloads. And that's a pretty big differentiator, not just from the size of these data centers, 1,000 acres, to the intensity of that workload, whether it's the AI workload, machine learning, or data analytics. It's just using a whole different set of infrastructure and more intensely than your traditional data center that is more CPU intensive and not that GPU or TPU intensive.
Adib, I do a fair amount of work on the consultancy side in regard to revenue models. And we have a question here talking about business models and data centers. And you're so close to the Xendee tool and all the scenario modeling, but do you sometimes find, whether it's projects or for businesses or collaborating with utilities, does all the scenario modeling help you figure out the way to go forward as a business?
It does. I mean, being involved in projects, learning from the challenges, and just meeting great people that are trying to solve some really hard problems really helps us gain that extra set of eyes and ears to see where the market is going and what the trend looks like. So, we were sensing this AI energy challenge years ago, which is why we invested in developing models for small modular nuclear reactors, for example. So it's really helpful, as we collaborate with companies like Mayfield and other leaders in the space. It really helps us work on the solutions that drive the most impact and business outcomes for our customers. So it's been really, really interesting and personally rewarding to be in the conversation and involved in these. But we sensed it a few years ago, and that's why there's a pretty sophisticated SMR model in the Xendee platform, along with other technologies, like I mentioned, fuel cells, linear technologies, and then the thermal technologies as well, both from meeting the thermal load, but also thermal storage. So it's exciting times. You know, the whole microgrid and complex distributed energy space was always kind of just trying to get over the hurdle. And I was thinking that fleet electrification and fast charging, because, you know, again, you're in many, many megawatts of energy that has to magically appear at a certain address, that would drive the adoption of microgrids. But it actually has been the data centers, because they have very, very tight timelines, and they have to execute with high efficiency and have an extraordinary high level of confidence in what they're suggesting, why, the economic justification, along with the other opportunities that they're focused on, whether it's decarbonization or resilience or some combination of these. It's been really a strong pull for microgrids, and people really looking at complex challenges that they need to solve. So it's been very rewarding to be in those conversations and see that. But like I said earlier, when you're looking at, you know, 100 to megawatts to gigawatt, every step matters. And little things are actually big things. So you got to do a lot of these scenario analysis that you're talking about, and also sensitivities, Robert. So when somebody's going and proposing, you know, billions of dollars in assets to be purchased, installed, you really need to have a financial decision support system.
Bankability.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
huge.
But
I just
you know,
had-
you also got to make sure it's giving you the right answers and you're putting in the right information. It's huge. It is huge.
I think we have to segue here, but I just want to bring this up as a comment, because it's in part how I got into the industry, working on commercial finance, economic development side, hearing more and more about bankability of projects, quantifying ROI, in particular, given the complexity that we're talking about here. I think, Luke, if you want to ask Skip a question on this.
Sure. Yeah. A question that we've gotten both ahead of this webinar and during is a broad one, Skip, and it's who pays for these and how. And I know there's no singular answer to that. It's an evolving issue, but there are many different potential avenues to that, to paying for this energy infrastructure. You know, Oregon has a couple bills in the legislature right now touching on data center development. But if you could give us just the quick 90-second version of kind of what you're seeing the lay of the land look like in terms of, you know, is Amazon building this entire facility and footing the bill and building it off grid? Is it a mix of Pacific Power working with a hyperscaler, et cetera, et cetera? Just how you see the lay of the land in terms of financing these projects.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And, you know, just a little plug for an event we're doing July 10th on data centers and energy innovation in the modern grid. We'll have an executive from Amazon there, as well as the local utility they worked with here in Oregon to kind of build out and address exactly step by step, sort of walking through how it all came together and what went into the scenario planning, and also, you know, to Adib's point earlier, there's a need for a lot of really great planning ahead of these projects, but then inevitably too, there are some things that just aren't accounted for, right? And there's a spike, and they have to, you know, address that and assess it in terms of like, okay, is this the new normal, or was this an anomaly, and what are some of the new investments we need to make to account for that? So having a great partner in the form of a local utility is critical in this, and having the flexibility of a variety of different sort of types of energy and infrastructure associated with that at the ready is also critical. One thing that I think has been interesting is if I look at Central Oregon and the expansion that Meta, formerly Facebook, did in Prineville. They launched a project called Open Compute, where their goal was to essentially transparently publicize everything from schematics to how their data centers were built and operated to some of their kind of net zero operational goals that they were striving for. And one of the reasons why they chose Central Oregon was because the climate was relatively mild, and they were able to have open air cooling mechanisms for the actual servers in the data center. And they accounted for particulate in terms of a filtering system that they installed and the like. And so you've got different approaches that companies are taking, but I think that on the whole, at the end of the day, a lot of the companies that are building this infrastructure want to see standardization and certainty from a planning standpoint. And right now you have anything but that. A lot of states are rushing into the lack of federal efforts here from a regulation standpoint to essentially figure out in their own regulatory environments what are some of the ways they can apportion costs and share costs in a way that they think is equitable, or at least that placates the loudest voices from a lobbying standpoint, depending on your view of how local politics works, whether it's cynical or not. But yeah, there are multiple bills in different states, some of them targeting a specific rate class for data centers and other high energy users. Others are trying to figure out ways to apportion increases in demand for energy more equitably across a lot of different organizations and entities that are putting more demands on the grid. And again, the complexity that Robert alluded to earlier is not making any of these efforts easier. And in many cases, this is another example of policy kind of a bit behind the innovation and the market, and it's trying to play catch up.
And another observation, at least that I would like to share around what Skip was just saying, is the business models. We're seeing energy as a service business model too, where the data center facility itself is managed, and then there's another company that actually is implementing and offering that on-site energy power plant as a service to the facility itself. So that's another approach that we're seeing people really investigating and adopting, is through energy as a service or microgrid as a service business model.
Yeah, I think Adib and Skip, I think that's part of the reality, right? Innovate policies lagging, innovations happening in the field in real time. There's a lot of tension there, and I think Lucas is going to go to the back end of the white paper sequence here, Adib, just because of time and what we're talking about. But maybe you can speak to the white paper a bit.
Sure. So we were curious as to how best to meet this gap in energy that data centers, specifically with AI workload, can go through. Is it just connect to the grid? Is it, and then just wait until you get an upgrade on the grid? Do you go buy a whole bunch of DERs right up front? What is it? And not to kind of push too hard on the button here, but the reality is that this multiple step approach that we settled on is what I think will speak to the earlier comments that Skip was talking about around the need for flexibility. But we did something here because we looked at both the West Coast and the East Coast. As you can imagine, on the West Coast, electricity is very expensive, but the electricity, the opportunity for further decarbonizing is more challenging. And then on the East Coast, the prices are very low for the electricity, but the opportunity to clean up the energy being consumed is much higher. And we were curious, what set of technologies, what sequence, what investment strategy would make the most sense, and how strong is the business case for, relying just on the grid. And what we found is, from just a tempo of project implementation, initially you have to just go with whatever the grid provides and then backfill with DERs. And then you build out the DERs as the data center's load grows. And it could be traditional technologies like battery and solar, while maintaining the backup generators and then the opportunity for combined heat and power. And when we looked at it, we saw like this phased approach where you have this utility connection. So, and then bringing in the distributed energy resources and the various technologies in a sequence over the life of the project, with the flexibility to plug in new technologies like small modular reactors, was the most robust, reliable, both from an economic justification perspective and also from a decarbonization perspective. And the flexibility to reorient those resources and assets at any time. And by that, I mean, there's a fear of stranded assets, where the utilization of the asset just isn't going to be there, and the payback and the economics and that return on investment just isn't going to look too good. But with this phased approach, it really addressed and mitigated any of those challenges. And what stood out to me personally was that in none of the scenarios, the grid made sense, especially if you bring in combined heat and power. So if you're addressing the thermal and the electricity, it's just too strong of a business case. West Coast and East Coast. I mean, East Coast, it's like cheap electricity. But even at those very aggressive price points that the East Coast has versus what the West Coast has, the grid never pencils out. So that was something that stood out to me. And the other was how much more efficiently, both from an economic perspective and from a decarbonization perspective, a data center owner-operator can benefit from microgrids and these cogeneration plants. Because once you have that combined heat and power, you're addressing cooling, especially if you bring in absorption chillers. It's just too strong, too good of a business case to ever go back to the grid. And the trend we're seeing is, people need to get these projects going. They're on 1-year timelines, not 7, 14, 15 years that the utility usually requires to upgrade. And they're very interested in being able to reorient these assets as new technologies come in, or if the grid connection improves and it still makes economic justification. But we did not see an economic justification when you're addressing both the thermal load and the electric load for the data center. So there's a probability that any grid upgrades would be the stranded asset and not the DERs on the side.
And we will attach the white paper to a follow-up email to all attendees, along with the recording from today. I know we're at the hour here. Would love to chat more about this, but I do want to make sure that we get to one thing at the very end. We also have some contact information on screen. This will also be included in that follow-up email to everyone who registered. As Skip mentioned, though, we will be co-hosting an event in Bend, Oregon on July 10th. Maybe Robert, I'll hand it off to you to close this out. Tell us a bit about the event.
I appreciate that, Lucas. And I'm going to actually bring in Skip a bit. As Skip, Adib, and Jacob Betcher, the CEO of Mayfield, are all partners on the Great Transformation. Skip came to me about a year ago. The idea of having an event that would really tackle these topics that are pretty important from an economic, energy, and policy perspective. Skip, why are we bringing the great transformation to Central Oregon?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Well, in large part, it's to essentially center a conversation that impacts in large part, the rural part of the state. Outside of the Portland area is where a lot of these data centers are going into, especially the hyperscalers. And so we want to be thinking about, how do we effectively look at the modern AI tech stack and make sure that everyone's conception of what that means includes clean tech energy innovation at its base. You don't realize the full potential of positive benefits of AI and massive compute power if you don't solve for everything that we talked about earlier on this webinar. So this event will bring together some of the leaders from some of the major hyperscalers who will be talking about some of the pain points or challenges that they're facing as they're looking to meet demand more effectively that's out there, and where AI is headed and going to drive future demand. And then we're also going to hear from a number of folks who are doing innovative work, including those on this call, as it relates to addressing some of these challenges, and hopefully doing so in a way where we're doing so with an eye toward our environmental stewardship and hopefully not making things worse. And it'll be hopefully the first of what we plan to have as a repeatable event. This is an ongoing set of problems and challenges that we hope to be able to address annually and revisit and see how much progress we're making. There'll be a mix of public, private, and even some academic folks in the room. And we hope to be able to have some good outcomes that flow from this event on July 10th.
I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Adib. Thank you, Skip.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.